everybody, I'm back again with another show. Basically, where I'm going to be, for those of you who don't know yet, I am currently reading my dad's manuscripts. I'm on chapter 10 of A Voice in the Darkness, and as I'm at chapter 10, I'm pretty much almost halfway through. So if you are just tuning in now, I highly recommend going back to previous episodes in order to get caught up on where I'm at, because this is kind of right in the middle. Or if you're like, I don't even want to know about this one, there are other stories, so you can go back even further and listen to stories then too. Who am I to judge? Not me. At any rate, chapter 10 of A Voice in the Darkness. I'm going to hop right in. Okay. The wagons were not ready by the appointed day. In fact, they were not ready for 3 days, despite what seemed like the most of the garrison sawing and planing and fitting and nailing. There was a lot of drill. Some of the men who had come with the prince were new to the army, and so were kept at their weapons drill so they would be able to parry, slash, and thrust automatically, even in the midst of the screaming, clashing din of battle. It was always surprising to many how well the drills worked out when it came down to serious business. The crossbowmen were continuing to train as well. Several shipments of crossbows had been sent down from Plutarch, and Iharch had his own men busy making them as well. In this case, since the word had come down directly from the prince, and since it did involve something that was unmistakably a weapon, he had willingly set men to the work. Even then, the numbers ready and available were a little short of Dolag's expectations. What do you expect, Dolia? The man's the steady, reliable, and sometimes even inspired on the battlefield, but he's not very good as an administrator. Perhaps I expect a little more than the man can give. Well, what crossbowmen have we got? How are they coming along? They're doing very well. And you say what crossbow men we've got? As though we had about 50 or so. I won't say I'm completely happy with the numbers myself, but I'd say we've got enough to give Gulani a bit of a shock. I'd also say that despite the mess up with the wagons, Ihark seems to have done not too badly. He could have done better, but he didn't, and we'll have to deal with the matter as such. Do you want to wait for the rest of the wagons? No, I think moving fast is a little more important than making sure every last detail is correct and precise. Do you want to wait for the rest of the wagons? No, I think moving fast is a little more important than making sure every last detail is correct and precise. We may notice the lack of a few wagons, but not likely. Borlis was suggesting we make them mobile forts, but I don't see it. The Nanisses will just shoot down the draft horses and then deal with the wagons piecemeal. But think of this. Armored horses. Pulling the wagons up into the midst of an enemy, and the wagons shooting arrows or flame out into anybody nearby. He shook his head regretfully. Having armored horses would mean having to expand the teams, since they'd have to haul the weight of the armor as well as the weight of the loaded wagons. And the wagons loaded are heavier than a normal wagon. Then there'd be the burden of finding more forage for the expanded teams. He shook his head again. Padra was thoughtful. So we'll just have to go with what we've got, sort of a mobile fort, but one that has to pick its spot and stop there for a while? True. It's better than going out and having men work their butts off building a fort, only to find that the Nisses have already passed you by. What's this? A messenger had come up hurrying. Lord Prince, Commander Ihark sends to tell you that there's a bunch of Nanisses at the gates. Dolag and Padra exchanged glances. There hasn't been any word of approaching enemy, has there? Dolag turned back to the messenger. How many? I'm not certain, Lord Prince. I understand it was about 24. Dolag grinned at the messenger. Boy, remember to report the important parts of the message first. I had a view in my mind of 40,000 odd Nanisses outside the gates, and none of our scouts having reported so much as a whisper of their presence. I'm sorry, Lord Prince. I won't. Doleg waved a hand at him. Don't worry, I won't eat you this time. Go back and report to your commander that the message has been brought. Yes, Lord Prince. The youngster was off at a run, glad to get away from the prince, who he thought he had annoyed seriously. So, Padua, let's be off and find out what this is all about. The message was not quite accurate. The party at the gate consisted of 20 Lantha light horse, escorting 5 Nanissas. The Nanissas were tough-looking men, only a little less tall than the Longbeards. Than the average Lantha, dressed in leather, all leather with a few metal ornaments. They wore long beards, and their eyes were gray or brown and almond-shaped. Their skin was the color of a light leather, and their expressions were grim. One of them spoke, his accent so thick as to be near impenetrable. We seek the leader of the Lantha folk, or one who can make decisions in his name. I am Doleg Strag, Prince of Lengthwheel. Ah, it was said that the prince himself led the frontier army, but we were not sure. We ask your protection, Prince, in return for our service. Protection? I am Togadai, born heir of the clan Yisinai. Urquil Golani felt that my father was too close to a certain Golani, who had sought to foment rebellion against the Urquil. He therefore sent a force to remove my father and all his family, to put into my father's place a man who bore more to the Urquil's liking. However, I and a few men escaped, bringing our families away. We have been fugitives ever since. There was no hope of finding refuge among any of the Nanissa clans, so we came this way to seek you out. Doleg considered. That would be just the sort of story to tell in order to be free among us to spy for the Urquil. Togadai shrugged. So you could say, and I understand your feeling. I will offer to tell you all I know about the Nanissa strengths, where they are grazing, and you could have us serve in some part of your nation that Golani does not threaten. Ah, I see you've given it some thought, I see. So must I. I will at least give you temporary refuge, until I've decided what to do with you. How many are you? Near 50, twice that in women and children. Not a large party, then. Give me a moment. I'll arrange a party to escort my message out, and escort your people back in. Togatai gave no sign of objecting at being treated as less than a trustworthy guest, which Doleg noted as a point in the man's favor. He was willing to give the band asylum in return for any information about the Nanissas, but not if it came at the expense of coddling some chieftain's notion of what his status demanded. Togadai apparently accepted the fact that his situation required him to take whatever treatment his protectors gave him, which Doleg considered would get him decent treatment. First things to do then, Padra passed the word to these people. Togatai and his people, and his folks, are guests of the prince. I know there are a lot of hard feelings this side of the border against people on the other side, but these people are under my protection. Yes, Lord Prince. Doleg shot him a sideward glance, then realized the honorific was because there were guests present, not because he disagreed. Now, Togadai, let us go find some place more comfortable to discuss what knowledge you have. Certainly, Lord Prince. Clearly a man of quick wits, to understand so quickly what an honorific was used for the Prince of Lengthwheel. That evening, Padra made a call on Doleg in Doleg's quarters. You're going to accept our newest recruits? Togadai and his lot? Most likely, barring some good reason to do otherwise. The Nanissas don't go for complicated stratagems like slipping a band of spies into a country. Mostly just bands of scouts who bring back what information they can find. What's your thinking? Padra scratched his head. Well, I might be said to have a prejudice in the matter. My grandfather, many years back out in the high plains, offended his Iroquois. his Iroquois yell. Sorry, hold on here. Hadra scratched his head. Well, I might be said to have a prejudice in the matter. My grandfather, many years back, out on the high plains, offended his Iroquois. The story is not clear on what his offense was. Some versions have it as a matter of a horse, others a matter of a woman. Just as in Togadai's story, the Iroquois sent men to kill my grandfather and all his clan relations, particularly sons and grandsons. My own father escaped with 4 fast horses, my mother and myself, a babe of about 6 months. No, we weren't Nanisas, though we seemed to have some related customs, and the language my parents spoke is very close to Nanissa. But then, at least a quarter of Lengthwheel is a generation from felt tents and wandering herds of sheep. My father was able to get himself taken in on the army of the Prince of Lengthwheel and made a place for me to step into at his death. So, as I say, I'm a little prejudiced when it comes to accepting fugitives from high plains. I see. I'd heard bits and pieces of that story, of course, most often from people who are trying to get you placed in favor of some brother or cousin of theirs, so you can imagine the slant they put on it. Mostly they made me think of that if people had to go through such lengths to try and blacken your name, you must be a worthwhile fellow. And so are you, save for your lack of capacity for wine. I lack capacity? You, my Lord Prince, have taken refuge in your married state to avoid having been found drunk under any table in sight. Ha! Well, in that case, I think a princely inspection of the Grey Loon is in order. Will you come? Will your wife not scold you and 6 brawny guardsmen haul your unconscious princely body back home? Are you trying to weasel your way out of it? It was a common thing for Doleg not to come to bed until late, what with the demands of rule and command. So, Hertha seldom stayed awake waiting for him. She wasn't happy with the situation, she knew, but she also remembered the hours her father had kept, particularly in the seasons when the Rochevelati made their raids. Better save her annoyance to try to change things that could sensibly be changed. She was awakened late at night by the sound of Doleg stumbling over a chair in the darkness and muttering. He never actually got to bed, but rather fell asleep in the chair. At least Hertha surmised that to be the case when, after a good 10 minutes, he still remained in the chair. "I'll talk to him in the morning," she muttered and rolled over. When she woke in the morning, she saw he was indeed asleep in the chair, one boot off and one boot on. He also had a fierce headache when he woke. It would be, she decided, an even better punishment for me to be in a cheery, good mood all day. Halt! Fort up! The drivers of 2 wagons pulled to a halt the teams of horses that had been ambling along. Soldiers jumped from the wagons before the wagons had fully stopped moving, and ran to unhitch the horses. The drivers then led the teams over to one side. This had been a training exercise. The right had been chosen as the direction from which the supposed attack was coming, so the teams were led to the left. The soldiers then rapidly pushed and pulled the wagons into formation, with the tongue of the rear wagon thrust up underneath the one in front. A light chain was looped through the front wheels of the rearmost wagon, and from there, through the rear wheels of the forward wagon. A set of wooden mantelets were erected across the left side of each wagon, the mantelets being pierced at regular intervals to allow crossbows or other weapons to shoot. Crossbows were present at most of the mantelet piercings, a light ballista at one of the others. The men carefully did not glance toward where the prince was watching the whole proceeding. Padra looked at Doleg. Well, better, but it's still a good thing we don't plan to do this in the face of an enemy attack. This test was only using 2. How will it be with 24 or more? You really sure you want to use these this summer? we'll be able to use them better with more practice. Doleg considered. No, we need every advantage we can get. Too many people remember Lame Creek and all the nasty fights that led up to it. We've got to go out with a special weapon or two, and the prince confident that we'll do it again when the time comes. Padra nodded. I suspect you're right. I certainly hope so. Do you think we can have the men practice fording up when we stop every night along the trail? I mean, without giving the men the notion we think they're incompetent lumps? All too many of them are incompetent lumps. But yes, I think it'd be best we do that. Besides, we've had all the recruits out for a bit of a drill every evening, so it'll be just in advance of that. No hint that the prince is not satisfied with their work, just that he wants to make sure that you can do this in your sleep. And see to some of you move, and you are doing it in your sleep. So we'll practice all along the way so you can do it in the time it takes to an army of Nanissa to gallop 100 yards. I don't think anybody could do it that fast. So long as they make the effort and can get so they have a reasonable time and don't mess the procedure up beyond recall, it doesn't matter. On the way back to the town itself, Doleg suddenly pointed. What's that? Trail wagons under guard? I can see that fool. I mean, what's in the wagons? He shouted orders to his guards, and they cantered over to closer quarters. It soon became clear just what it was. It was the remains of Togatai's people, young men on horses, trying to look like warriors, with a fair sprinkling of actual warriors, trying not to look threatening to the Relantha escort. The wagons, mostly driven by women, and many of the wagons had little brown faces looking out of the little dark eyes. There they are, my newest subjects. Yes, indeed. Padra shot a glance at the prince. Now you've got that funny look of yours, the one when you're about to make some pronouncement that ends up making a lot of sense, but not until you've argued it with a whole lot of people who don't see. Doleg chuckled. Not quite that. Just a notion about what we're going to do with the debated land when we take it back. Nothing clear so far. Not clear enough to argue about. Tomorrow? Yes. We can't delay matters any longer. I should have taken the army out a week ago. I don't suppose you can delay any longer. It's going to be a long time for me to be patient waiting for you. I'm sorry. Yes, I think you are. I'm about 2 steps from disguising myself as a soldier to follow you. Turn God's toe. I'll have to warn Padre to be on the lookout for some new and clumsy little recruit. Clumsy? I'll show you who's clumsy, you big military oaf. Oh-ho. Do I need to call my guards to protect me, or should I subdue this attacker myself? It took some struggle and a lot of laughter on both parts, and ended with the two of them tangled pleasantly together. So far, Togadai's information corresponds with what we already knew. Doleg nodded. Yes, but then we've only been marching 5 days. Nanissa don't take fortified cities. That's one of the problems we have fighting them. We tend to base ourselves on towns and take supplies from the locality. They base themselves on their herds, so now they're here. The next day they can be over the hill somewhere. Padra shrugged. So as usual, we keep marching until someone decides we're a threat and gathers an army against us? Just so. Well, we've made our scouts and patrols know the situation. That's the best we can do. On the morning of the 7th day, they came on a village, the remains of a larger town. It still carried the name Skipsum, but its inhabitants were still Lantha, but they were all quiet and subdued. Doleg himself went to meet with the elders to assure them that Lanthguil was back to stay. Even the presence of the prince did not appear to encourage them. Lord Prince, the old bent man who spoke for the village, said, the Nissas are not here at the moment, but they will come back. One never knows with them. They might not come, or they might come. and decide I ought to not have received you. Or they may simply decide not to allow the village to exist any longer. We live on their sufferance, Lord Prince. If any man of theirs desires anything, be it a knife, a bag, or a woman, he will take it. They think nothing of killing us for objecting their orders, protesting their herds, feeding on our crops, or simply because we are not Nanisas. If the divine pair favor us, those times are passing. Yes, Lord Prince, and you are here now, and we cannot refuse anything you wish. But in 2 weeks' time, perhaps a month, some Quail of the Nanisas may be in your place, asking why we aided you. There is little Doleg could say to that, other than argue the outcome of a battle not yet fought. We will demand a little of you, and we will do our best to see that no Nanissa comes demanding things of you again. Come, Padya. Togadai and his band had come straight through the debated land without pausing, so his knowledge of the territory was not extensive. He had, however, a number of observations to make, which were invaluable, since they gave a few advantages and disadvantages of parts of the land from a Nanissa point of view. Further, in all the points where Togadai knew how the Nanissas acted or reacted, his knowledge matched the prince's, giving that much more weight to the observations that went beyond Doleg's accumulated wisdom. Togadai had had little information about the men in command of the territory between the rivers, nor had he picked up much, as his whole purpose was to come through unmarked. Doleg, however, knew that a man named Sulbana ruled this particular area. Though he was under the command of the Uraquil Golani, men in Sulbana's position, as was well known on both sides of the border, had to move carefully. Anything they did that might seem like a move to gain too much power could result in the Uraquil slaughtering himself and his family. On the other hand, doing nothing could well see him unseated by some younger man under him, or being accused by the Uraquil of ignoring chances to expand Uraquil's territory, with similar result to overambition. Doleg was fully acquainted of the habit of the Nanissas to avoid battle until they had an overwhelming force, or at least equal numbers to the enemy. If it so happened that Further, they did not move in one huge band, but each group taking its own route to a particular gathering place. If it so happened that the enemy arrived there first, the Nanissas would withdraw before them until the rest of their forces had gathered, quite frequently attacking the enemy from flank or rear. Doleg also knew that Sulbana required time to gather sufficient force. Since the Nanissas roamed in scattered bands, messages would have to be sent to each band. However, those messages would have gone out no less than 3 days after the Lanthas crossed the Little River. Because of the way that the Nanissas gathered, they would not necessarily all gather in front of the Lantha army. For this reason, Doleg kept patrols continually on all sides. 2 days out of Skipsum, Doleg spoke to his commanders. They're gathering in front of us, mostly. The forward patrols report more and more skirmishes with Nanissa scouts. Borlus, can you add anything to that? He didn't bother to explain about Borlus's constructs. Most of the commanders knew about them. Others just had a healthy respect for Borlus's abilities. Borlus nodded. Not much, Lord Prince, only to confirm what seems to be happening. The nighttime campfires are mostly out in front of us, with the ones to the side and the rear being much fewer. He held up a cautioning hand. There is a possibility, albeit small, that the forces to the sides and the rear are minimizing their apparent size, and the ones in the front are maximizing theirs. No, that's not likely, but it's a possibility. Thank you, Borylus. 5 days later, they found the Nanissa main army ahead of them. Doleg surveyed them from horseback, knowing altogether too well how unthreatening the first view of the Nanissa army had been at Lame Creek. No, unthreatening was not the right word. Only a strong belief in the abilities of his own men. On the other hand, telling himself that they could beat him here, too, was not the right way to think. It was a massive force of men on shaggy little ponies, men in a mix of various armor, or no armor at all, though each of them had a bow and quiver of arrows, and each of them could use that bow to deadly effect. Everything ready? Dolia, you irk me sometimes. Yes, everything's ready. Do you want to give me some hints about how to ride a horse, too? Dolia grimaced. Sorry. You think they'll take the bait? I think so. Be ready and go to the alternate plan, just in case. The classic notion of Nanissa fighting was to ride in and out, launching arrows, until such a time as the enemy were sufficiently disordered, and only then riding in too close with to close with the foe. Doleg had the wagons lined up in a row, slanting backward, with the rest of the army drawn up behind that point. The wagons will only be a surprise to them once. We'd better make the best of it, Doleg had told his commanders. Doleg watched the first, almost tentative approach of the enemy. There was not much threatening about the wagons, though a few men were lying down under them, presenting very little in the way of targets. The wagons themselves had been drawn up earlier, when there was little time for them to be arranged without the great haste they had practiced first. No, the practice had not been wasted. There would be other fights, other ties, and at least sometimes the wagons would have to be drawn up quickly. Doleg couldn't really say just what exactly the Nanissa commanders thought of this row of wagons in front of them. He hoped they'd consider it only a barrier to be dragged out in the way of the ropes. Their usual in-and-out tactics couldn't work properly while a large section of the Lantha front was covered by those wagons. Whatever the commander's thoughts, his men came up launching arrows over top of the wagons, while some came out shaking loops of leather rope to drop over the wagons and haul them out of the way. Doleg saw one of the Nanissas go back down. Some crossbowmen inside the wagons had gotten stirred up and shot entirely too soon. Third God's toe! This cost us a surprise we needed. I'll have the men's hide after the battle. It seemed the Nanissas did not notice, or perhaps they did right near the fallen man, but there was some hesitation and loosing of arrows at the only target in front, the wagons. On the other flank, though, the nomads came on unchecked. And suddenly the air was full of arrows, and Nanissas began to go down. They rushed the wagons, apparently planning to overwhelm them by main force, and the ballistae opened up as well. The ballistae, powerful as they were, could put a bolt right through 2, sometimes 3 men. The liquid fire was a deadly weapon, but it could be best employed at close range, against massed enemy. The first reactive surge of the Nanissa brought them close enough, and the liquid fire jetted forth. I wish there'd been more men up front there. I wish there'd been more men up there to be caught in that, Doleg muttered. But that's enough for it to have a good effect. The first wave of Nanissas, badly battered by missiles and fire, fell back. Doleg cast an eye along his line. Nobody seemed to be of a mind to run out and chase the enemy. The Nanissa could seem to rush away in disorder, when their foes broke white ranks to pursue, turn back, and strike a telling blow. The Nanissa commander changed tactics immediately. Instead of trying to harass the Lantha drawn up behind the wagons, he had his men coming down to shoot at the wagons themselves. On the flanks, where the wagons did not cover the Lantha line, his men rode in and out, shooting arrows as they came and went. Doleg made a quick assessment of the situation. He turned to Padra. Get more crossbowmen up amongst the wagons. Right. The Nanissa commander had caught on immediately, not only to the deadliness of the liquid fire against his horsemen, but to the one main disadvantage of that weapon. Its comparatively short range. Galloping in and out and back out again, they practically never came within range of the liquid fire. On the other hand, The crossbows were deadly at ranges equal to the Nanissa bows, and the Ballistæ could harass them at longer ranges. Then, in the wagon at the extreme left, someone inside had managed to get the liquid pump working at the Nanissa's riding in toward the Lantha ranks. In order to do so, they'd had to swing back the mantlets on that side, making the soldiers in that part of the wagon slightly easier targets for the Nanissa arrows. On the other hand, they'd managed to pump fire out into the Nanissas on that flank. The effect was deadly. The enemy there dissolved into a mass of fleeing horses with men trying to control them. The pump crew paid dearly, though. One of them fell headfirst out of the wagon, an arrow through his throat. There were still Nanissas out there who had not been part of any of the attacks, though. On the other hand, their commander had clearly decided that more head-on attacks made no sense. He pulled his men back out of the range of the Ballistæ, and apparently considered the situation. He can't get us coming on the front. He'll spend time holding us here and work in around our flanks or rear. They've still got mobility, Padra nodded. They've still got mobility on us, but they won't be in the back of us at least until late night, and nighttime is no time for their sort of attacks. It'll have to be the rear. I can't see them climbing their horses up the hills on either side of us and having the horses fit for an attack again in less than an hour. Not to mention the fact it'd have to be an all-out attack because they'd have a God's lost rough time going back up those slopes. Right. I'm getting a germ of an idea of what we can do. Instead of sitting here while Salbana has his troops working the way around Bacchus. You're going to attack him? Not really. All he needs to do is pull his people back, and we end up in the morning in a situation where our flanks aren't covered. Or, if we push the cavalry forward, they end up scattered and disordered for the morning. And you know what Salbana will do then, don't you? Ha! Pretty much yes. All right, what's your plan? Doleg didn't have much of a hope of trying to make a major movement like this unnoticed. It would have been nice, he thought, for Salbana to have woken up with us in crossbow range of his camp. But this will have to do. The line of wagons was split up, and one half run forward, then set up in an arrowhead formation, with the point facing back toward the Lantha camp. Because of the smaller numbers, the formation had spaces between each wagon, which spaces were filled with crossbowmen. Another similar formation was set up to the rear, with half of the wagons. The wagons in front had faced a couple of sharp raids from the Nanissas, but the most trouble they could cause was to launch arrows blindly, or so closely that the Lantha could shoot back. Things heated up as the morning light came. The Nanissas swirled around the wagons nearest them, but their arrows made little difference. Each of the end wagons had been turned so that the sides, with the pierced mantlets, faced the main force of the Nanissas. Each end of the wagon was also armed with a liquid fire pump, which, after the first clashes of the early morning, made the Nanissas hang out back of the range of the pumps. Any time the Nanissas moved down far enough, ballistae, and sometimes even crossbows, opened fire from the next wagons in line. The Nanissa losses were never heavy in any one soiree, though they mounted up after a time. Messengers reported back to Doleg as to the situation of infantry around the wagons, and he knew he was taking losses too. The question was, which force would have taken unacceptable losses first? It wasn't until middle of the morning that a sweaty, dirty, light horseman on a heavy, dirty horse came galloping up to Doleg from the rear. They're coming up from behind, Lord Prince. Numbers? 5,000, perhaps more, Lord Prince. Doleg nodded. You've already told Padra? Yes, Lord Prince, just before I came to you. Good. Go back to your commander then. Yes, Lord Prince. The Nanissas were superb horsemen, and could get more out of their tough little horses than most Lantha could get out of their larger mounts. On the other hand, the Nanissa coming up behind had just spent most of the night riding through rough country and over hills. If their first appearance didn't panic the Lantha, they would not be capable of much in the way of riding in and out. Well, he'd left the rear defense to Padra, with the aid of several wagons, and he'd have to trust that Padra could do what was necessary. What were those people doing out there now? It seemed that several of them were rushing back and forth, well in front of their line of battle, dragging something. Ah, bundles of brush, which, after a couple passes, stirred up a fair cloud of dust. They'd come galloping out of that, leaving the wagon defenders and their men around them less time to shoot. He considered sending a few squadrons of cavalrymen to help, then decided against it. Too soon. Trust the men in and around the wagons. They'd have a bad time of it for a bit. But if the Nanisses came in too close, they'd have to face the liquid fire again. And here they came. Aha! Someone up there had been thinking, possibly Sylvana himself. A few men were dragging bundles of brush behind them, and the bundles of brush were afire. The smoke they gave off would add to the difficulty shooting at the main body. But they were intending more than that. Bent low over their horses to present less of a target, the men dragging their brush came in close, then swung their horses around, swinging the brush bundles in curving arcs. They let go of the ropes. The burning bundles continued their way, several of them ending up next to one of the other of the wagons. Doleg wondered if the idea had been to set the wagons alight, or disrupt the defenders. Whatever had been the intent, the men around the wagons went to work at extinguishing the fires, which disturbed their formation just long enough for the Nanisses to get that much closer. There were some frantic moments before the Nanisses began to withdraw again. Some fires were burning out there. Now, places where the liquid fire had struck and splashed would remain burning so long as there was anything there to burn. The Nanissa tried variations on the same trick several more times, and shortly the pumps were pumped dry. On the other hand, the crossbowmen inside the wagons were still, by and large, unharmed, and the ballistae were still operational. "Messenger!" Doleg shouted, and a man was by his side immediately. "Go down there and tell the men in and around the 3 wagons at the point to advance close enough to support the wagon at the end of the right flank, up there where the trouble is." "Yes, Lord Prince." The man was off in a shower of clods. This might come back to bite him, Doleg knew, if the Nanissa managed to make it down that far into his center. On the other hand, if this could prevent them from getting near his center, it was worth the risk. He watched as the messenger arrived, casting an eye back to the wings, near obscured with dust and smoke. The Nanisses were coming in again, riding out of the smoke and muck to shoot, then ride back out again. They were not able to do this unharmed, though, so it was still a matter of which could take the pounding for the longest. Ah, there went the wagons, up and galloping forward in the style that had used and practiced. There could still be trouble if the enemy saw them in time, and swarmed around them before they could get set. Even then, there'd be a lot of Nanissa dead to buy that tiny victory. Lord God's toe! It's just as if some Nanissa had read his thoughts. Here they came. But the wagons, just as if this had been the plan all along, pulled to a stop in an arrowhead fashion, one that would allow them to support each other against the attack. There wasn't time to unhitch the horses, but the crossbows and ballistae began to shoot. In their rush, the Nanissa had put themselves in range of the weapons, in and around the wagons further along the arrowhead formation. Worse still, when they realized their situation and turned to race away, they were in range of several dozen weapons for that much more time. There was a long pause, with nothing happening forward. 2 of the wagons, which had been sent forward, were no longer able to advance, having lost 2 or more horses per team. Someone out there was taking initiative, though, for one of the partial teams was unhitched, then replaced wounded horses in the other. 2 wagons went forward, maneuvered into place. Then one team went back to bring the other wagon forward. Still, the Nanisses were not coming. Doleg looked back. Yes, the Nanisses had attacked and from the looks of things, had been sent packing with heavy casualties. Was the leader back there a man of great tactical brilliance, able to come up with a new and deadly plan to win with worn horses and men against a style of fighting that had to be new to them? A horseman was rushing up. Well, that could be a report, for good or ill, as to what happened back there. At the very worst, they had driven the enemy off, but had taken heavy casualties. He turned his back to the front. Matters in the rear could still be dealt with when he knew what they were. There was no movement from Sylvana's men out there. There was still no movement out front when the worn and dirty rider came up from behind. They're beaten back there, Lord Prince. They tried to ride in and shoot the wagons, but if they rode in close enough to be sure of putting an arrow through one of the arrow slits in the mantlet, they were close enough to be hit by the crossbow inside the wagons and sometimes by the fire pumps. They've pulled back now, and they need to let their horses rest before they try again, if they do. Thank you. You can back to your commander now. Yes, Lord Prince. The man is off at a canter, his message delivered. He can now afford to rest his horse a bit. There was a movement to the front now. The Denisses were attacking the left leg of the wagon formation, since they only had 3 wagons, at most, to fight there. Someone over on the right hand had some initiative, though. One of the wagons had come up to reinforce the right, went racing over to the left, finally stopping by with the side facing forward to allow more weapons to be brought to bear. How many times could they keep up those attacks, Doleg wondered. Was Sylvana sending in fresh troops each time? If so, he'd eventually have nothing left but men who had already been beaten back once. Perhaps it was time to do something more? Messenger. Yes, Lord Prince? Go down to the commander of the wagons, have them advance 50 yards, or as near that as possible. Be on the present of forwardmost wagons. Stop and ford up as soon as they are attacked, and hold them off. Wagons forward for 50 yards of front of the forwardmost. Stop when attacked. Yes, Lord Prince. The messenger's horse leapt away. Messenger. Yes, Lord Prince. Another messenger was by the prince's side. To the commanders of the main body of troops, advance behind the wagons to support them when necessary. Commanders of the main body, advance behind the wagons, support when necessary. Yes, Lord Prince. Doleg watched the 2 messengers hurry away. Now, if he judged matters right. Down below, achingly slowly, the wagons were hitching up and moving. The teams had been kept well back, so valuable horses might not be lost in the expected tax on the wagons. This meant that the drivers had to take the teams forward as fast as that could be managed and hitch up their assigned wagons as they reached them. Another burst of Denisses came rushing down toward the leftmost wagons, the usual rushing, turning attack, launching large numbers of arrows, but never coming into hand-to-hand distance. They were deadly marksmen, even from the back of a running horse, but the arrow slits in the mantlets were very small targets. Coming close to be at all sure of hitting one of those slits brought them well within accurate range of the crossbows aimed by the stationary men inside. As though it had been only a trial to be sure that there was no weakness on that arm of the arrowhead, the Denisses turned and rode away. Doleg curled his hand into a fist, watching his forces move forward. The furthest wagons forward did not join the formation. Low on ammunition, Doleg guessed. And likely amid all those arrows, some had actually passed through the arrow slits, and in sufficient numbers that some of the men inside had been wounded. Well, the precise reason would be something to determine after the battle, unless the reasons were too specious. He wouldn't be too hard on them. They'd done their job, stood up to a hard pounding for long enough that they'd worn out the Denisses, well enough indeed. Now the wagons were hurrying forward in line. Some places they disappeared into the patchy smoke and dust that still hung over the field. The army, in a steady, well-drilled line, followed after. Doleg looked back. The Denisses in the rear were attempting to rush in again, but Padra had that all in hand. Messenger! Lord Prince? Tell the commander, Padra, that the prince is moving forward with the army. Yes, Lord Prince. The messenger was off. Come on, Doleg called to his guards and staff. We're going to follow up the army. When they reached the point of the wagons that had taken the brunt of the fighting, going was a little bit more difficult, with dead men and horses all over the field. Now the dust and smoke had burned their eyes and nostrils, cutting visibility a few body lengths, if that. They came up behind the ranks of their own men, and Doleg could see a strain on some faces. It was not impossible to tell whether or not there might be massed forces of Nanisas rushing toward them. It took a while to work their way through the ranks to the front without causing a panic in the length of the lines. When they got through, Doleg turned to one of the men, a tough-looking, weathered old fellow with a crossbow. Where's your commander? The old fellow shot his jaw towards the left. Last I saw, he was that way. Could be anywhere in his muck. Thank you. Doleg wasn't going to stop and give the man lessons on the proper forms of address to the prince. It wasn't even something to be worth keeping in mind for when the battle was over. No. What he wanted was these men to follow his orders for a little while longer without having to fret about courtesies and such rot. He found the commander of this particular part of the line just a little way to the left. We want to advance. I think we've upset the Nanisas, and if we move forward, I don't think they'll stand. Pass the word up and down the lines. He looked over his shoulder. Messenger! Yes, Lord Prince. Go tell the wagoners to hitch up and move forward. Wagoners forward till they see the enemy, then halt. Yes, Lord Prince. Doleg waited. It would take a God's-rotted long time to pass word up and down the lines. Precious instants during which Salvana might be getting his men ready for some sneaky Nanissa stratagem that would turn this fight into something worse than Lame Creek. It wouldn't do, of course, to let people see the prince fidget. He had to be calm, showing his demeanor that he was well aware of everything that was happening, that he had all matters in hand. One of the staff, a young officer, his position due mostly to his status as a nephew of Isdr, took a sip from the water skin hung at his saddle, then offered it to the prince. Doleg gave him a look that wilted him on the spot. Sorry, I'll have a drink and the rest of these fellows can have a chance at theirs. He waved an arm toward the ranks. He saw chagrin on the boy's face, but said nothing to ease the sting. If that fellow had what it took, he'd take the right lesson from that. If not, he might be one of the sort who'd be looking for revenge, petty or otherwise. But that was for later. The commander beside him called to his men. Forward! Mind your dressing, now! Yes, mind your dressing, Doleg thought. In this kind of stuff, we can be minding our dressing and finding ourselves turned half around when we get through. But that was something else he couldn't say. They had gone about 20 paces, infantry paces, when they were shouting and a sound of fighting ahead. Steady now, don't break ranks. There'll probably be plenty left for us. It wasn't for the prince, the commander-in-chief, to say such things, even to the infantry closest to him, but he had to do something, if only to reassure the 10 nearest men. The smoke was gone, and the dust was less. Now, and the wagons loomed up, standing still in a very rough line, with what seemed to be thousands of Nanissas around them. Thalkanzi! Doleg shouted, and the rest satisfaction of hearing it taken up along the line as the men moved forward. In effect, that was the finish. The Nanissa had already been handled roughly that day, and now, with a line of those horrible belching fire wagons standing before them, the sudden appearance of the rest of the Lantha army out of the smoke and dust, they paused only a little before they fled. Keep your dressing! Doleg shouted. If they broke up in pursuit, Salvana could rally even a small part of his men, and the Nanissa Yurkuil might still turn this around. In the end, though, it didn't turn out that way. Toward the evening, a message came from Padra to say that the Nanissas to their rear had faded away into the hills. The rearmost force was holding steady, just in case. Camp where you are, Doleg sent backward. Keep your eyes open. Tomorrow we'll want to keep pressure on the main body to keep them from rallying. Okay. So, That was the other one. Lots of message recalling. I don't know how I feel about that. You know, on one hand, you know, they do it all the time. In Star Trek The Next Generation, they have people repeating orders back and forth to each other. I think it might be a bit much. It feels kind of, when you're reading it, it's different than when you're saying it, because when you're saying it, it's being acted out. It's a bit different. I don't know. I don't know. I might have to use a different kind of literary device in order to like have the words being repeated. At any rate, that's neither here nor there. So I appreciate you all tuning in, and I will talk to you again next week. Have a good night.